Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I rise today to speak on behalf of the bipartisan compromise amendment that Senator Ben Nelson and I have filed, on which we will be voting very soon. Before I get to the specifics of our amendment, let me address more generally the challenge, indeed the crisis, that we are facing as a nation. Over the course of the past year and a half, and particularly during the last 6 months, we have witnessed the collapse of the housing market, the unraveling of our nation's financial institutions, and the evaporation of trillions of dollars of what had been invested in the stock market and in people's retirement accounts. As a result, millions of Americans are worried about whether they now have enough money to retire, how they will make ends meet if they are already retired, or how they will help pay for their children's education. I have heard from far too many Mainers who have had to delay their retirement plans because they no longer have the nest eggs for which they have worked so hard. The crisis that started on Wall Street has become a crisis on Main Street of every community in America. Madam President, the deeply disturbing economic report released last Friday underscores the magnitude of the challenge that we are facing. Nearly 600,000 Americans lost their jobs in the month of January, bringing to 2.5 million the number lost since the end of summer. The nation's unemployment rate is the highest that it has been in more than 16 years. In my home state of Maine, job losses totaled 3,400 in December, and the unemployment rate has reached 7%. It seems that every day brings another report of a business laying off hundreds or even thousands of workers. Just Friday, we learned that Katahdin Paper in East Millinocket, Maine, is being forced to lay off 140 workers for at least a month because the business simply does not have enough orders to keep these workers on the job. These are people who have worked hard their entire lives to take care of their families, and now they fear for their future. I know, Madam President, that everyone in this body recognizes the difficult straits that we are navigating as a nation. Finding a consensus on how to address our economic crisis is extremely difficult. There are some who believe that no action is better than the action that has been proposed. I could not disagree more. The future of our economy depends on immediate action that is targeted and effective. And the American people rightly expect that this action will be bipartisan, that we will come together to address the most serious economic crisis in generations. And that's why I joined with my good friend, Senator Ben Nelson, and a group of senators from both sides of the aisle, including the presiding officer, to help craft a bipartisan compromise to achieve these critical goals. And Madam President, I want to recognize that regardless of how many Republicans vote for this package today, that many were involved, that several were involved in the deliberations in which we participated. Their insights and input were invaluable in crafting the compromise package that we are offering tonight. Our efforts to reach a compromise would not have been possible without this hard work, this dedication, this commitment by our colleagues on both sides of the aisle. So here is what our amendment would do. First, we will provide more than $200 billion in aid to states. I stress that, Madam President, because I have heard some commentators say that there's no money in here, that it's been slashed, that it's been cut, that there's nothing left for the states. Madam President, $200 billion is included in this compromise. Approximately $87 billion of this amount will flow through a temporary increase in the federal share of the Medicaid program. I know that as a former governor, the presiding officer is well aware that for most states, health care costs are the #1 item in their budget. If it isn't health care, it's education. The loss of jobs often means the loss of health insurance, and it's well established that the number of persons relying on Medicaid increases in a poor economy. Moreover, this increased demand for services occurs at precisely the time that state budgets are under the most pressure. Our proposal, therefore, includes $87 billion in assistance to states through a targeted temporary increase in the federal Medicaid matching rate. Maine will receive an additional $490 million in federal Medicaid funds through this provision alone. And I want to recognize and salute the work of my colleague from Maine, Senator Snowe, who worked very hard in the Finance Committee with her colleagues to shape this portion of the aid. Putting money in the hands of states is a common-sense way to stimulate economic growth. Leading economists have found that targeted aid to states will generate increased economic activity of $1.36 for every $1 spent. Moreover, this temporary increase will help states avoid cutting back on health care coverage and services at the very time that the number of families needing help is increasing. Now, Madam President, some of my colleagues are opposed to this provision because they say that it will never be temporary, that once we increase the federal matching rate, it will become a permanent entitlement. Madam President, we've only to look at history to know that isn't true. In 2003, Senator Nelson and Senator Rockefeller and I negotiated a similar temporary increase that proved effective in staving off drastic cuts in Medicare, Medicaid, and we need to provide similar assistance again. And I would note that it was 18 months that we did that for. So I believe that we can do this in a temporary, targeted way. Next, Madam President, our amendment provides $41.6 billion for education programs. That's right, Madam President, more than $41 billion in new funding for education programs. It includes $13.5 billion in funding through the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, what's known to most of us as special education, education for children with special needs. This new funding will help fulfill a promise that the federal government made back in the 1970s when it first passed IDEA. At that time, the federal government promised to pay 40% of the national average per pupil expenditure for every child in special education, and we've never come close. This is the granddaddy of unfunded federal mandates. This